The FDA has been around for more than 100 years with a mission to protect public health. But while that's the goal, it's not always successful. And though the public is often quick to point out the organization's failings, these setbacks can't simply be blamed on poor management. In fact, Daniel Aaron, a researcher focused on the FDA, believes many of the issues we see today are due to various constraints placed on the FDA by outside authorities, something he got an up-close look at during his time working for the agency.
It felt like there were a lot of barriers for the FDA to accomplish its public health mission. And a lot of these barriers were kind of not really talked about much in the public. And often the dysfunctions that we see are not actually FDA's fault. I mean, we can talk about kind of some of the internal issues at the FDA, which I think are real, but FDA is dependent on Congress to provide it resources. It can't really enforce the law on its own for the most part. It has to go to the Department of Justice to bring a legal case. It's often subject to political interference or influence from the president. And the Supreme Court has facilitated presidential control over our agencies like the FDA.
Aaron is an associate professor of law in the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. He published a 2023 article in the Yale Journal of Health Policy, Law, and Ethics that details issues with the FDA's review system. His interest in the FDA was sparked as he grew up, watching different family members try to manage their medical conditions.
I was wondering about why pharmaceuticals and medical products were so expensive and so inaccessible. And on the flip side, why I felt like so many products didn't really work or weren't properly tested when we have an FDA.
It came to a head when his own mother needed a hip replacement. She had been promised a new model that was a fully metal implant instead of the common ceramic or plastic material. It would shorten recovery time and create an easier experience overall.
So she was super thrilled about this metal on metal hip. And then, of course, it ended up leaching metal ions into her blood. And so seeing that happen, and then mom also getting frustrated with her developing brain fog and a sense of like that her brain wasn't functioning as well as it used to. And then her finding out that she had elevated metal ions in her blood. Yeah, that was super influential for me. And it really raised a lot of questions for me about the FDA's role.
Aaron's mom experienced memory loss, difficulty processing information, and other cognitive symptoms that she still deals with today. He later learned that the implant had not gone through traditional FDA review and instead was marked as substantially equivalent to other models on the market. This designation helps streamline the approval process and waives the need for pre-market approval, which is necessary for devices that are considered high risk. The hip replacement Aaron's mom was given was recalled, but the damage had been done. And though it would be easy to blame this oversight on laziness or ineffective processes, we have to look at why the agency doesn't prioritize every product that comes across its desk. Aaron says often the root cause can be boiled down to the fact that the FDA doesn't have enough resources to properly do everything it's tasked to.
One of the problems with our approach to FDA is that we give it all these responsibilities, but we don't give it a commensurate amount of funding or personnel. And so as a practical matter, FDA's had to pick and choose which of its responsibilities to prioritize. And others, it has just kind of neglected or even explicitly said that we're not going to even try, right? And I think the food additives situation is one of those examples where FDA said, you know what, we're not even really going to fully try here. I mean, they tried for something like 20 years, and over time it got whittled down, and now they don't really do much at all, I would argue.
The FDA does have a pre-market review for food additives, where companies need to scientifically prove the safety of the ingredient. However, many products don't need this review because they can be considered generally recognized as safe if qualified experts in society agree. The FDA keeps a list of these ingredients when manufacturers notify them of a new product, but this reporting isn't mandatory. The agency has similar processes for other products, like medical devices, so that they can give their full focus to the ones that pose the highest threat to public health. There are 3 major grades for classifying medical devices, with Class 3 being the highest risk. It also requires pre-market approval before it can go to the public. It seems like a good system to compensate for the lack of resources, but just like the metal-on-metal hip, devices can easily be misclassified.
I think that there are at least a few factors. Number one is that we haven't given enough resources to device regulation, right? That's pretty uncontestable. And so that gives FDA an incentive to try to reduce how many of the most cumbersome reviews it has to do, right? Oh, okay, let's classify more stuff into less risky categories so that we limit our workload so that things are manageable. And to be clear, if FDA doesn't do that, then it risks overloading its staff and then actually having staff departures, which actually has been a problem in some FDA centers. So there's a resources and personnel issue that encourages some inappropriate classification.
Aaron says that another factor is pressure from companies to classify products a certain way. Manufacturers have a pretty direct line to the FDA because of a payment system called user fees. Companies that produce products regulated by the FDA pay a fee as a way to supplement funding the agency gets from Congress. Every 5 years, the user fees are negotiated and reauthorized by Congress. In exchange for the fees, the FDA commits to performance goals like completing product reviews within a certain time frame. These user fees are often criticized, but necessary for how our system is currently set up. A report by the U.S. Senate shows that user fee programs account for $3.3 billion for fiscal year 2025, nearly half of the FDA's overall funding. Congress allocated $3.5 billion to the agency.
It's not the FDA's fault that Congress provided it inadequate resources and that it had to turn to corporations to get their funding. So, I really don't blame FDA for these user fees, but I do think that they're pretty problematic. It's not a very good position to have industry kind of having the reins over a large portion of the agency's funding.
Aaron worries that this process positions the FDA to serve the desires of the industry instead of public health. The FDA regulates about 20% of America's economy, which makes it an obstacle for large companies who are prepared to lobby and advocate heavily for their products to be on the market.
The pharmaceutical industry has long been one of the top, if not the top, lobbying industries in our country. And it has lobbied heavily to shape FDA's approval processes. It's also kind of counterposed with the food industry, with the medical device industry, with the tobacco industry. So FDA is in a bit of a tight spot as far as the forces that it's contending with. And I think the only way it's going to flourish is if it has public support and if people pay attention to the way that politicians are interfering with the agency and declare that that is unacceptable. And so I hope that we, over time, develop an appreciation for this agency and lend our support to it.
Unfortunately, industry involvement isn't the most pressing issue. As we mentioned earlier, the agency has been understaffed for years, a problem that's only getting worse with the most recent layoffs.
To give you one example of why resources really matter, the food center, from the last data that I've seen, spends about 2/3 of its budget on food inspections. So that's basically going into facilities that produce food and making sure that there aren't rats, that there aren't feces, that proper methods are followed to ensure the lack of infectious disease. So that's 2/3 of the food center's resources on that. But let's remember that the food center also regulates cosmetics and regulates dietary supplements and food, right? So, let alone inspections, FDA has to do all this food regulation. So if you see how one small aspect of its role, which is inspection, takes up 2/3 of the food budget, you can see just how we have not given the agency enough resources to do all these millions of tasks that we've assigned it to do.
And on top of these challenges, outside factors continue to influence how well the FDA can operate. Aaron says that presidential intrusion has been a big issue for the agency. The president can appoint an FDA commissioner and also influence the agency's priorities, policies, and operations. This power dynamic can be devastating, which is why at least 7 former commissioners appointed by both political parties have argued that the FDA should be an independent agency. Despite this bipartisan support, the Supreme Court disagrees.
And in fact, the Supreme Court has made it really hard to make agencies independent. The Supreme Court has a view that agencies should be accountable to the people. And so when we elect a new president, then that president should have the ability to change what FDA does. Otherwise, FDA could be a rogue agency. Right? So there's this fear that agencies are kind of going to go rogue and do a lot of tyrannical things, which is actually something that agencies can do if they're not checked. But this view of the Supreme Court has kind of made it so that it's actually very hard to make agencies independent.
However, there are some successful independent agencies that the FDA could follow. The Federal Reserve, for example, makes policy decisions based on economic data that do not need approval from the president and isn't funded by Congress. However, it's held accountable through a biannual report and is required to testify before Congress. There are members on its board of governors that are appointed by the president, but they serve for 14 years to make sure that one administration can't monopolize all of the members. Aaron thinks that copying this model for the FDA would be a major improvement for the agency.
And again, this is to reduce the political influence over the agency and allow it to operate on behalf of science and public health.
Join us next week as we discuss the FDA's process of pre- and post-market reviews and why they're not as effective in today's product market. You can find more information about Daniel Aaron and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.